straight from the horse's mouth, or in this case, Intel's mouth. The new NUC 13 Pro, the Workhorse, Intel's positioning this as a business class machine, but you can actually do a lot more with it. I'm building quite the collection of small form factor machines around here at level 1, but I had to take a look at this one because it's 13th generation. It's Raptor Lake, but in a small package. That seems like that would be a power challenge, right? No, actually, it's shockingly power efficient. Insanely power efficient, actually. But let's dive in and take a look. So this one, it's not exactly retail packaging, comes to me courtesy of Intel. So take this with a grain of salt. Meet the new Intel NUC 13 Pro. It's 13th gen CPU. Didn't I just get the 12th gen CPU? Listen, this is the latest. The mini PC that means business. Powerful business with a 4x4 configuration. And there's a tall and a slim version. The tall version will fit a 2.5-inch drive, so you could have, 8 terabytes of 2.5-inch SSD storage in a tiny form factor. But this one is the slim form factor. All right, first up, you have the power brick, which is bigger than the device itself. It's a Delta power supply, 20 volts, 6 amps, 120 watts. The 20 volts part is actually important for the USB-C side of things. Technically, this is a pre-production sample, so your packaging would be different if you order this. But I'll take it. In the box, you've got a lot of cool mounting hardware for Visa and otherwise. You have a USB reinstallation kit, 16 gigabytes. So appealing. Now the tall version, you can fit an extra 2.5-inch drive in here. The short version, not so much. There is enough room to add a B-key SATA drive, but mine came equipped with a 512 gigabyte Intel NVMe. I got the SSD wrong, sorry. It's an Intel label, but it's not actually an Intel SSD, it's Samsung. The SSD is a PM9A1. That's actually Samsung. It's not an Intel SSD or Solidigm, which might be my expectation, but the PM9A1 is a top-notch SSD. It is a very high-end SSD. Little surprising to find it in here, but hey, I'll take it. And 16 gigabytes of Kingston DDR4 is notebook DDR4. There is a hardware clear settings jumper and I think a hardware TPM header, but I'd have to double check the documentation for that. The BIOS on mine is socketed, which is very handy in case I want to do naughty things with the Thunderbolt interfaces. And yes, this is one of the few Intel NUC devices that actually has 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports. Well, Thunderbolt 3, Thunderbolt 4, we'll test that. There's not a lot of difference between Thunderbolt 3 and Thunderbolt 4. It has to do with charging and power delivery aspects. But that brings up the I/O. Let's take a closer look at the I/O. We've got our 2.5 gig NIC Intel chipset, of course, dual HDMI, dual Thunderbolt, one 10 gigabit USB port, and one USB 2.0 port. There is also an optional screw hole here that will hold a cable retention clip so that you can't easily pull the power cord out of the back of this thing, which is nice if this is going to be using the Visa clip or the Visa mounting plate to mount this to the back of a monitor. At the front, we've got a 10 gigabit port, a charging 10 gigabit port, and a combination headphone microphone port, and our power button. As always with these small form factor machines, I'd like to see more USB ports, but I really can't argue with the Thunderbolt ports. We're going to do some exciting things with that in just a minute. Let's get this hooked up and run some benchmarks. Now for business class machines, you'd be surprised how popular this form factor is becoming, because if you do everything up to and including even light programming tasks, this is probably all you need. These are actually cheaper than some thin clients from just a few years ago. Thin client being a very lightweight machine that you would remote into a more powerful machine. It actually turns out between the software licensing end of things and everything else that the i3 versions of these NUCs with minimal RAM and disk configurations are often cheaper than, commercial thin clients from major providers. And so Intel and other companies sell a lot of these machines around this very small form factor. They're easier to maintain. They're brick-like. If something happens with them and something goes wrong, you just go to the closet, grab a spare. There you go. Also, the price has sort of fallen a lot. But this is a higher end model. This is an i7. It's a lot of cores. I've never experienced the Bluetooth device setup portion of Windows setup, but that was actually pretty cool. I paired my Logitech keyboard to the NUC no problem, and it was also rotating through a bunch of languages. It's a pretty cool feature. I don't know if Intel did that or if that's a new feature of Windows 11, but overall pretty cool. Although because my keyboard and my mouse are a little different, it paired the keyboard but not the mouse. A little weird, maybe a bug fix for Microsoft. Also, the Windows setup thing, I haven't plugged in the network because obviously. So of course Microsoft has to do the militant thing and make it so it's like, in order to continue, you're going to have to plug in your network, your internet. We definitely need internet. This is where the FTC should get involved because Microsoft, what are you doing? What are you doing? Come on. In no way is that Intel's fault. Totally a Microsoft thing. I'm going to lay that entirely at Microsoft's feet because obviously. Shift F10 is what brings up the command prompt there. Can't wait for Microsoft to patch that out. Foreshadowing. So the magic to get around that is Shift F10 to get a command prompt and OOBE/bypass NKRO and hit tab. It should be nkro.cmd. You just do by and hit tab and it'll probably autocomplete. But good lord, can the FTC please get involved to deal with that? Because why? Has everyone forgotten Bill Gates' awful memory during the antitrust trial? Time for that again. When you run that command prompt script batch file, basically, it reconfigures setup and then you have to restart setup. So you have to go through, it's like, yes, keyboard, command prompt, yes, United States layout, yes, blah, blah, blah. But you'll have the all-important, I don't have internet button at the bottom to bypass all of the mandatory Microsoft account setup. And then it says, hey, let's create a local account, which is what I wanted in the first place. I don't want to connect this thing to the internet. I'm testing it. I'm just going to install some test software. It doesn't need to be linked to my Microsoft account, which, by the way, when I have done that and opted into, say, an insider preview on a test machine, literally every other machine that I was signed into also opted into the test previews and updated the Windows 11 version to preview on different hardware. That kind of a mistake makes me never trust you again with an account, ever. Not even going to take the chance. Just FYI. Anywho, the Intel part of the NUC is great. It's just that we're going to put Linux on this. Don't worry. And it's going to run like a champ because Linux loves this kind of hardware. It's fun times. Fortunately, once in Windows, I was able to hit Control Escape, type Bluetooth, go to Bluetooth, hit Tab a few times, add device. My Logitech MX mouse showed up, hit Tab a few more times, enter, added, done. And now I have a mouse. Now for our software setup here for Ada64, Geekbench, etc., I'm using Winget. And to install Winget, you got to go and download the App Store app updated thing, which ironically doesn't yet require an account. You can just Winget install Ada64-Engineer. Winget is the most awesome thing ever. Definitely check out our video on that we did ages ago. I was a whole other person. Now starting with the Ada64 platform benchmarks, we're not off to a great start. This is a DDR4 platform. It has DDR4 notebook memory, DDR4 3200. And the timings aren't even really that great. 22, 22, 22. It's good quality, high endurance, high reliability memory, but it's still DDR4 3200. 95 seconds of latency on DDR4, it's going to hurt us a little bit for anything except productivity tasks. But that's why Intel says meet the new Workhorse. For business class applications, data entry, and even up to light programming. If you're a web programmer, I'm sorry, mostly you would probably be able to get away with something like this. Okay, Node.js has a billion little teeny tiny files that's going to stress your SSD more than your CPU, but we're still talking about 16 logical threads, 12 cores on this. So you've got kind of a lot of performance cores, and you've got 8 efficiency cores. Okay, 4 performance cores, 8 efficiency cores. And our power usage is just south of 90 watts. Now we've got 120 watt power brick, and we do have USB charging as a capability, as an option. So you've got that 35-40 watts of headroom between the charger, something demanding 40 watts of power, and the absolute maximum that this can turbo, which brings us to cooling. It does have a cooling fan, and you can hear it, especially when the system ramps up. Not sure if you can pick up the sound of that, but it's a low hum, but it's not high pitched. Most of the time, you'd never hear it. Fortunately, it is not a high pitched whine. There's no high pitched component to it at all. I'm not sure what wizardry they've done in order to be able to pull this off. You hear the sound of air moving. You can tell that there's a motor in it, and something is moving air. Looks like it brings air in from the sides and exhausts it out the back. The mesh on the side is small enough, it'd probably be an adequate dust filter. I would say that this would be fine except under extreme neglect situations or hospitality situations or like a 7-Eleven. I've personally taken care of technology at a convenience store, and the rate at which they accumulate dust is shocking. Fortunately, I'm not in that business anymore. I don't have to deal with it. But I would be worried about putting something in that type of environment that had a small fan in this kind of configuration. The i3 is probably not going to run the fan as much. Again, you don't need 12 cores for some of those data entry, some of that kind of stuff. So maybe those kind of scenarios, it would be completely fine. Or if you can put it somewhere away from the counter, somewhere away from where all the dust is going to accumulate, it's going to be totally okay. This is one of the better fan implementations on these small form factor machines that we've seen in the small form factor space. So good job, Intel. 1733 with the 9502 score on our multi-core configuration. This is pretty good. This is doing better than our previous 12th gen Alder Lake platform. It's a smaller platform. It has dual Thunderbolt, so those are upgrades over the 12th generation. Is it a huge upgrade over 12th gen? No. 12th and 13th generation, especially when you're rocking DDR4, not a lot of difference between those platforms. But if you're on something older, this should give you pause. There are a lot of rank and file workers out there that are still on, 3rd, 4th, 5th generation Intel. The cutoff point for Windows 11 is your Intel 8000 series, so like an 8700. There's a lot of office drones, sorry, you know who you are, that are rocking that 6-core or a 4-core like the i5 or the i3, and this would be a substantial upgrade for those information workers. And technically, we're not even really using any USB ports. I do have the one USB 2 port and 3 other Type A ports, and yeah, if you want to use the Thunderbolt as a Type C port, you can. You totally can. That's fine. Now for our graphics, it's the built-in Intel graphics. Nothing special, nothing to write home about. For productivity tasks, it's fine. But for everything else, you could do a click adventure, but it's not for gaming. It's for business productivity. It's a workhorse. Remember, it's a workhorse. It's not a play horse, it's a workhorse. But it's not a one-trick pony either. I've done something unholy. No, actually, I'm just using Thunderbolt as it was designed. And I have to say, out of the box, Intel got the Thunderbolt experience out of the box exactly perfectly correct, which is shocking. Because everybody else, you got to fiddle with it, you got to download an app, you got to download a driver. They never expected anybody to actually use those Thunderbolt ports. Sometimes if there's just the one, but we got 2. Hey! The display is now connected to our GTX 1070. Yes, I know the 1070 is a little old. It's fine. Connected to the 1070, which is connected to our NUC via Thunderbolt. The entire computing apparatus is this box and that box. And that's it. And yeah, you could use a more powerful GPU. Wouldn't recommend a GPU more powerful than, say, the Arc A770. Intel GPU, or another competitor's GPU that's about the same performance tier. Actually, the A770 is pushing the upper limits of what you can do with Thunderbolt 3, but maybe we will see Intel make Thunderbolt 5 or 6 8 lanes wide instead of 4, or an optical interconnect, or something that is, 16 gigabytes per second, not 4 gigabytes per second, as we have with Thunderbolt 3 and 4. Something. But this 1070 is a substantial gaming upgrade over your small form factor machine. So if you had one of these for, your laptop or something else, and you go to visit relatives or grandparents or something, and they just needed a little compute device, they could do this. And if you don't want to bring your laptop, you could bring this and then game on that. And then this would be a reasonable gaming experience from this plucky little system. Now, it is only 4 P cores, so don't expect miracles. It's like gaming on 4 cores again. It's like the past. This is a productivity machine. But if you're like me and you're hacking on Thunderbolt, putting it all kinds of places it's not supposed to go, then this is a handy platform for connecting things. This is also really handy for Linux. If you want to get into Linux and do stuff with Thunderbolt on Linux for things like networking, and you wanted to build a cluster out of little low-cost, high-performance machines, you can do that with a Thunderbolt connection. Yes, the Ethernet connection is 2.5 gigabit, but what if you could connect 3 of these machines together with their own dedicated 40 gigabit link? That's what Thunderbolt gives you. And the Intel Thunderbolt driver in the Linux kernel is limited to about 10 to 12 gigabits per second. That's solvable with some software updates because not a lot of people are using that Thunderbolt interface. But if you had 3 nodes, each node could connect to the other 2 since it has 2 Thunderbolt ports on each node. And then you would have a fully connected, redundant cluster with dedicated 40 gig links to each machine. You could move information between each machine at 4 gigabytes per second, and each one of them would have a 2.5 gigabit Ethernet link to the outside world. That's something I've been working on for a while, and I think we'll make a really interesting video over on the Linux channel. Speaking of Linux, let's take a look at Linux on this thing. Now there are some other hardware features of Intel brand NUCs. They're fairly consistent. They're not perfectly consistent, but they're fairly consistent. And I'm happy to report that some of these very hard to find features are present on this NUC. This is not something you find on every small form factor machine. The first is iSCSI. You can add iSCSI targets to this. Yeah, I mean it is a workhorse. It's for business use. So you could boot this thing off of iSCSI. iSCSI is a network storage thing. The home lab people will be real excited about that. So good job. There's also HDMI CEC control. So this thing can wake up a television. Yes, it can. When you turn on your NUC, it'll wake up your television. So if you wanted to have an i3, which is like the most insane overpowered Chromecast ever with custom software, you can totally do that. And again, Linux sort of works better there than Windows, but this is a feature the BIOS supports. There's literally auto turn on display after waking up. This is great. This generally works great with like the LG OLED TVs that I use for gaming and everything else. You can't get that feature even on GPUs. It's really frustrating because with the LG TVs, they don't automatically wake up. And I really want to do some kind of a hardware mod to use the serial port to wake it up, because you can do it through the serial connection. Just have a little tray out. It's like, oh, let me send a wake up to the monitor to turn it on, because otherwise you're going to turn on the monitor when you're using it as an OLED display. And I ain't paying no $3,000 for an OLED computer monitor. That's just crazy. I also lose all ability to have proper grammar and punctuation when I'm fired up about something. Some more other obscure BIOS settings. You can disable BIOS updates from Windows Update. BIOS update from Windows? Yeah, that's been a thing for a couple of years now. Wake up, get with the program. But you can disable that, which is kind of like a hardware lock for your BIOS. It can still be updated from the BIOS itself, but this is nice because Windows Update can't push out an update that's going to break your machine if that's the kind of thing you're worried about. If you're in a corporate fleet, this is actually really nice because updates can be pushed out from Windows Update to automatically update your entire fleet, because let's face it, you're overworked and you're not going to keep up with the BIOS updates anyway. It's going to make the system more stable having that feature. You can also schedule automatic wake-ups. You can wake up in case of power loss. And there's even a thing to turn the charger on when the system is off. So the USB port that does 35 watt charging can work even when the NUC is off or asleep or whatever. You can control that through BIOS options. Good job, Intel. Nobody puts this much thoughtfulness and attention to detail in their BIOSes. And this has been like this since the Xeon NUC 3-4 generations ago. And it's nice to see the trend continue. The engineers that work on this, I see you. You are acknowledged. You are doing great things for the world. And it is a differentiating feature set that Intel NUCs have these features, because a lot of other small form factor machines don't. And they should. They really should. These are handy features. Especially the whole network boot, iSCSI, home lab. Yeah, it's good stuff. To install Linux, you'll have to go into the BIOS. That's not going to work with a Bluetooth keyboard. You're going to have to plug in a wired keyboard and mouse to install Linux. Go into BIOS, you're going to have to disable Secure Boot, at least temporarily. The new Linux kernels are signed for Secure Boot, but you're going to want to disable Secure Boot. I'm going to install Pop! OS. You folks at Microsoft, if you need a cheat sheet on how an OS installation should be, you can download the Pop! OS ISO for free. Pick up a NUC, set up Pop! OS on it, go through the OS installation a few times. You could probably get Windows installed right to where it needs to be. Just use this as a cheat sheet. I'm sure the System76 won't mind. Dare we try the Thunderbolt connection? It's a bit like the Cardassian neck trick. Will it work? Color me impressed. To get that right requires the whole stack of firmware, top to bottom, to work correctly, and a reasonably recent Linux kernel, considering this is 13th gen Raptor Lake after all. Now I know Thunderbolt 4 is basically the same as Thunderbolt 3, which hasn't really changed in almost a decade, but we did sort of cycle through a bunch of different Thunderbolt chipsets to get the bugs worked out. And this is working. I just ran LSPCI and I can see that the device enumerated correctly. I have the correct I/O region and it was able to attach a bus number. Those are sort of the big things to make sure that it's gonna work correctly and be fine. Fiddled with it a little bit more off camera and we're good to go. The Linux support on this, top notch. Including Thunderbolt, what's not to love? Overall, it's not bad. It is a highly competitive landscape in this form factor because this form factor has gotten super popular among business customers. Look, anytime somebody's got to make 1 million or 10 million of something, the cost is going to go down. And this is a 1360p processor. That single core score, 1700, is not great in the landscape of desktop class processors that can use a lot more power than this. But for a small form factor device, that is an incredible amount of horsepower. Remember the original NUC or like the Pentium G series? I mean, those were CPUs that ran at roughly half the speed of a desktop counterpart. This CPU is 3/4 the speed of a desktop counterpart at a fraction of the power. I mean, your nominal power usage is on the order of like 40, 45 watts just sitting at the desktop doing things. When the system is idle, it's less than 10 watts. You could get 3 of these and build a cluster and have it idle for less than 35 watts. Your storage is going to use way more power than all of your compute running full tilt. That's the world that we live in with the level of power efficiency that we have. The 120 watt, 20 volt power brick that we have with this thing, it's never going to run at full wattage, ever, because you would have it pegged. But the cooling on this thing can keep up. If you run Cinebench for an extended run, you're going to hear the fan. It's not loud, it's not whiny, you can't hear a bearing or a high-pitched whine or anything like that. Maybe I'm losing my hearing though. No, it's probably fine. You hear the sound of air moving, but it's not an annoying fan. And definitely some of the fans in some of the other form factors is a less pleasant noise, let's say. Intel's really gotten the engineering right on this. And if I were doing the home lab use case, I'd probably get the tall version so I could have SATA storage too. Just thinking out loud, that's got me kind of excited. Also think Intel should offer easy low-cost accessories for like the wireless charging pad that sits on top, because how cool would it be you just plunk your phone down and you're good to go, especially with the new software in Windows for pairing and things like that. That kind of stuff in Windows has me kind of excited, but the strong negative experience of the forced online account and all of that sort of stuff that Microsoft has done, and the bad experiences in the past where it's like, oh, you want the Preview Insider build everywhere? Okay, I got you. Let me just run at my own pace. But I digress. It's a pretty solid little piece of hardware. And again, thanks Intel for sending this over so I could take a look at it. If you've got an idea for some mad science or a project that you want to do with this, or just something you want to see how it runs, let me know in the forums at Level 1 Techs. I'm Wendell, I'm signing out, and I'll see you there.